Thank you for that introduction, I'm very honoured to have been asked to speak here. I think what Southampton is trying to do with this meeting and your interdisciplinary work on population health is really important, and I think a lot of institutions want to do this but actually don't put the resource and thought that clearly you put into it. So I'm going to talk about social change and population health, and I am going to draw on my work in Russia and elsewhere. But I just want to say that coming to Southampton has a particular flavour for me, because in the 1990s, like a lot of people, I became very intrigued by what David Barker was doing. And in point of fact, I was part of a group who, in London and elsewhere, where we set up a series of seminars internally to prove that David was wrong. But of course, that hasn't turned out to be the case. Indeed, I spent, from those early seminars, I then spent the next 10 or 12 years of my life doing research on fetal origins. But over the last 15 years or more, Russia and Eastern Europe has taken an increasing amount of my time and energy. And I think it's from that perspective that I'm looking at the issue of social change and population health. Usually when there are lectures on things to do with social factors and health, the emphasis is upon inequalities. I'm not going to really talk about socioeconomic inequalities within countries. This is not because I don't think they're important, but it's because I'm wanting to focus on the issues around what actually determines the health of populations as a whole. Because that essentially is what public health and epidemiology is concerned with, as well as many other disciplines which are represented here today. So I'm going to start with something which is definitively demographic in flavour. It's the Preston curves. I suspect a lot of you have seen these before. These are a set of ideas. It's a graph which Samuel Preston first published quite a number of decades ago. And it was to look at the issue of the relationship between wealth and life expectancy in different eras. And so this is a simplified set of Preston curves. But essentially, here you actually see the relationship between income per person, or GDP per capita it could be, and life expectancy around the time of 1900. You can see there aren't very many points there because there aren't a lot of countries which actually had data on which life expectancy could be based. Around 1930, you see the orange dots, and again the same shaped curve. 1960, more dots because there are more countries available for the analysis. But again, this idea that as wealth goes up from this very low baseline, under $5,000 per person, but there's a very steep increase in life expectancy, which then levels off. So by 1990, a lot of countries are up here which are relatively wealthy. But the key insight that Samuel Preston gave to us was not so much that there is this shape of curve, but that in each era there's a vertical displacement of the curves. So that these are actually incomes which are comparable across eras to the extent that economists can actually do that. And you actually find that for any one particular level of national wealth or income per capita, this is actually buying more years of life in succeeding epochs. So in other words, the relationship between health and wealth isn't something which is purely driven by wealth per se. And to cut a long story short, essentially Preston very elegantly argued that this was a very clear demonstration that with increasing knowledge in public health and in hygiene engineering, in our understanding of treatment of disease, of its prevention, that there was actually a diffusion of knowledge from countries which were generating this to other countries as they came along and could start using that technology or those approaches. So a very crucial part is that essentially global diffusion of knowledge and its application was very important in terms of understanding why there was a vertical displacement of these graphs. And that's going to be a theme that, one of my themes, which is about the way in which Eastern Europe in particular, under the communist period, represented a block of countries where that diffusion didn't happen, and its consequences were very serious for the health of the population. So I just want to look at some international trends in life expectancy at birth. What was shown before were a series of cross-sections where you couldn't see individual countries. So here on the left-hand panel, we actually see male life expectancy, and this is for the England and Wales, and then for Sweden, which actually has always been ahead of the UK. Over the period, the post-war period from 1950 to 2012, certainly Sweden's been one of the leading countries in terms of life expectancy. But for both countries, there's been a persistent increase. And then we actually have a country which I'm going to spend a little time on. I wish I could spend more time thinking about this, but Japan. Japan, as you see, came in 1950 from an incredibly low baseline. But even for men, there's been a very steady increase, such that in the latest period, Japan is on a par with Sweden. And then we have Russia. Russia is really doing very badly and doesn't show any consistent improvement. In point of fact, even with the latest upturn, positive development, if you drew a straight line through all those wiggles, which I'll tell you about, there's almost a sort of average downward trend, quite contrary to the other countries. I'm just going to quickly go through the same data for women. So again, England and Wales, UK, and then Sweden above that. This magnificent curve for Japan, for women. And in point of fact, those increases in Japan are historically unprecedented. There's no other country in the world which has undergone such a remarkable improvement in life expectancy. And then here for women, we actually see the same sort of pattern for Russia as we saw for men. Little evidence of any net improvement, but these very dramatic fluctuations which I turn to my attention to in there. So let's look at Japan, because it's quite remarkable in that respect. So Japan's starting point in 1945 was a very devastated country. This is obviously a photograph from Hiroshima, but not all of Japan looked like that, but it's emblematic of the poor state of infrastructure following the Second World War. And one of the issues is, how did Japan manage from that very low baseline to actually recover? It certainly didn't have much higher life expectancy in the pre-war period, although at the beginning of the 20th century, its life expectancy wasn't that different from England and Wales. But it then failed to improve in the period up to the Second World War, and certainly struggled, obviously during the Second World War. So what were some of the features? And what I'm going to give you are some bullet points now, which are really from work that John Wilmers has done, and a number of other people, looking very, very carefully at the reasons why Japan could have been so successful. Well, first of all, there was a strong commitment through the entire 20th century that you can read to health improvement in Japan. I think that was obviously something which was part in the pre-war period, integral, I think, to the imperial ambitions of Japan, but subsequently carried through to the notion that health improvement was the desirable good for the country. In the post-war period, there was a minimal diversion of resources into the military, in point of fact, due to post-war settlements and also political decisions within Japan itself, that there was minimal investment until very recently in armed forces. There was a development of a strong economy, which obviously may beg the question as to why Japan managed to do this, but one of the issues we'll come on to in a minute. There was also very rapid and effective urbanization. And as far as health is concerned, Japan stands out as having very late adoption of smoking and very low rates of smoking in women But very importantly, and this is something which, when I grew up, when I was growing up, there was always sort of slightly envious references, in the papers, Japan, well, they're very good at copying things. They can sort of make electronic circuits, but they're not really creative. I mean, that was a sort of cliched envy of the way in which clearly in the 60s and 70s the Japanese economy was going from strength to strength. But whatever it is, it was certainly a capacity to adopt and adapt technologies from what we call vanguard countries in terms of in health terms, in all spheres, in industry and in healthcare. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that Japan was very open for learning the best from around the world. So it had a lot of positive factors, which are in terms of lifestyle things, but also an openness and a capacity to learn. And I think that's a very important aspect of why Japan was able to actually do what it's done. What about Western Europe? Well, I'm now going to focus on Europe. Japan's going to be put aside. I'm going to focus on Europe. And the following graph shows, you can't actually differentiate, but for the countries which are shown up there, it shows a pattern of consistent increase in this, in the period, in the 40-year period from 1970. The point in red is the point about the UK. And yes, there is some fluctuation or variation between the European countries, but they're all consistently going up. Not one of them is actually going down. So a very consistent pattern of upward trend. And moreover, what is very remarkable, and I think it's one of the paradoxes which is not fully understood, because here today we heard quite rightly an emphasis on obesity, is this is despite the obesity epidemic, which is worldwide and certainly affects Western Europe as much as anything else. So we've got huge rates of obesity, certainly in countries like the UK, but there's no faltering of the improvement in life expectancy. One can say that will come next year or next decade, but so far there's actually no footprint of that, which is not a reason to be complacent, but it's an interesting observation. So what about post-war communist Europe? So this, just to remind you, those of you, and there are many in the audience to whom notions of post-war sounds like sort of ancient history. But essentially, following the Second World War, there was a division of Europe such that we got the Iron Curtain, which divided Eastern and Western Europe quite definitively. In the immediate post-war period, this was less rigid, but by the 1960s, it had really become something which was rather impenetrable. And it was the subject of many cartoons. It was a turning point, in fact. The Iron Curtain was something that Churchill coined in the immediate post-war period. It became a major barrier to the adoption, to the diffusion and adoption of new knowledge. How did that actually play out in terms of things related to health? Well, the public health, crucially, the public health function remained with a pre-war focus on infectious disease. If you actually look at the achievements of communism from the Russian Revolution, they were remarkable in terms of transforming a very, very poor and backward country in the early part of the 20th century to one which actually had got control of key elements of the infectious disease agenda. And in the immediate post-war period, indeed, the damage to Russia and Russia in particular was extremely substantial. There was mass displacement of people, a lot of poverty, there were famines in aspects of the former Soviet of the Soviet Union as was then. And there was a real concern about the outbreak of major epidemic diseases, whether that was cholera or typhus or whatever. And so even in the post-war period, the focus in the first 5 or 6 years following the end of the Second World War was understandable for the authorities in the control of communicable disease. But
that remained the case. When I first started going to Eastern Europe I first went in 1990, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I went to Prague, and I started teaching courses there, firstly for people from Czechoslovakia, as it was then, and then a bit later on for people all around the Eastern Bloc. And one of the big issues was that we were trying to teach what I call modern epidemiology. I mean, that's not necessarily Rothman, I don't restrict it to that, but ideas about analytic designs which could identify etiological factors, evidence-based medicine, clinical trials. All these things were completely novel to virtually everyone who came, because epidemiology was something you went into if you were a failed clinician. It was basically about the monitoring and control of communicable diseases, full stop. There was no profession, there was no intellectual or disciplinary development of techniques which we now take for granted, whether, as I say, that's analytic designs, case control studies, cohort studies, looking at cardiovascular disease or cancer or whatever. That was completely absent. I mean, completely is too strong a word. There were some notable individuals who actually managed to do something. So I can think of cancer epidemiologist from Russia, David Zaridsky, who did some very good work. There were things like the lipid research clinics from the 1970s, which were at the height of the Cold War, extraordinary international collaborations between American and Soviet scientists to look at cardiovascular disease. But these were the real exceptions. Okay, there was a low level, and still is, of expenditure on healthcare and health technology. So first of all, GDP per capita spent on healthcare through 2%, 3% compared to other industrialized countries, which in the post-war period was much higher. And certainly there wasn't a development of a strong health technology industry, whether that was in terms of diagnostic devices or indeed the development of a modern pharmaceutical industry. This was partly a reflection of high expenditure on military and military-industrial complex in a country which wasn't, in a set of countries which weren't as wealthy as Western countries. And actually, there was an important way in which population health improvement was not central to the political agenda. It wasn't, and this is actually something which people from Eastern Europe often talk about, and even today with respect to Russia, the notion that human life was not given the kind of value, even by individuals themselves, that seems to be part of a more Western European norm, but they just didn't penetrate. There was a cultural resistance to that. There was a limited exchange of health scientists. Okay, so the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was a most remarkable event, and in some ways one has to think about the collapse of communism in Europe as a sort of, we got away very lightly. Things that are happening in Ukraine today make one think that perhaps there's a sort of delayed sting in the tail, but essentially the collapse of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe occurred with limited loss of life and chaos. And this is extraordinary given that Russia, basically, the Soviet Union was and still is a nuclear power with a huge military machine. And I think Gorbachev in some ways will go down as a very important statesman in future histories. So it also created an extraordinary natural experiment. If one actually had the isolation of these countries, Russia and other Eastern European countries, what happened when that isolation was removed and there could be a freer flow of individuals, of wealth and ideas into the country. So let's first of all add to the picture of Western Europe some Central and Eastern European countries. These are countries which were not part of the communist bloc pre-Second World War. They actually only became part of the communist bloc as a result of the Second World War settlement. They're shown in red. And you can actually see that in the period up until the collapse of the Berlin Wall, really there was stagnation in both male and largely female mortality from as reflected in static life expectancy. But at the point indicated by the arrow, which is the collapse of the Berlin Wall, from that period onwards, we actually see, for men, certainly a sort of a hinge point, and life expectancy starts going up quite dramatically. And in parallel to that in Western Europe, one of the interesting themes here is, why is it going up in parallel and not actually just shooting up to converge? And I think that says something about inertias in populations in terms of how rapidly things can actually change. But that's another issue. So for females, there was also an improvement in the rate of increase, which had been slight here, but was going up quite steeply. But it looks as though, for various reasons, which I'll come on to in a minute, there was definitely the release of being an economist regime. The end of that led to really dramatic improvements in population health. So the Soviet Union itself, these countries which we just discussed were not part of the Soviet Union, they were part of the Warsaw Pact, but they weren't formally part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union itself was pretty huge and in many ways rather monstrous. So here we actually have all the issues around here. Here's Ukraine and so on, which is the problem which confronts foreign policy and the people in Ukraine now. But Russia is a vast country. It's geographically the largest country in the world. It spans 12 time zones and goes right to the Pacific. It's kind of like, who would have thought up a country like that? It's just ginormous. I mean, most people live in European Russia, which is to the left of here, but essentially the communications issues are absolutely vast. So, the collapse of the Soviet Union occurred a few years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and this is a picture here of Yeltsin standing on a tank in front of the White House, not in Washington, of course, but in Moscow, the seat of government there at the time, because there was an attempted coup. Once Gorbachev said, right, we're finishing the Soviet Union, there was an attempt to reinstate it, but that was unsuccessful. There wasn't any fighting in the street, it was a sort of political standoff which Yeltsin and the reformers won. So what happened in some countries which actually had been part of the Soviet Union, but actually had only been taken into the Soviet Union following the Second World War. I'm thinking here of the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, very small countries, but integrally they became part of the Soviet Union, and several of them were seriously Russified, and you'll be reading about them in the newspapers now about NATO, saying that we won't desert you despite the fact we've only got a population of 1.5 million and so on. So there's today they do have a much closer link with their Soviet past in terms of their population than the Central and Eastern European countries. So let's have a look. So here we actually have Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in here, and you can actually see that if you remember, Russia underwent a huge decline in life expectancy around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is here. And the Baltic states followed suit as well. But then, following a low point in 1994, they then sprang back and continued to improve. In point of fact, Estonia has a very sharp increase. It looks as though it is starting to converge with some of the Central and Eastern European countries. But again, following this rather bad patch, which actually happened even though they were independent states by that time. From 1992, they became independent. So even with this 93, 94, this disastrous period followed that of Russia, but they were still independent states. But they then joined the European Union in 2004, but even before that, they were making good progress. Similarly, you can actually see this for women as well. Okay, so what can we say about Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states? Well, I think the move to independence and then joining the European Union, increasing its integration, was associated with a change in attitudes to health. I think both at the level of the individual and that of the state, importantly. I think clearly there is dietary change. There are Vital Zatomsky and colleagues have claimed that, for instance, the very systematic improvements in life expectancy, which was partly declines in coronary heart disease in Poland, was the result of a very radical change in saturated fats. I'm not convinced that it's as simple as that. I think in Estonia, for example, they have become one of the most medicated populations in Europe in terms of their use of, for instance, antihypertensives, which are very effective ways of preventing very important cardiovascular events. They also introduced these countries, all of them to greater or lesser degrees, alcohol and tobacco control strategies, which were not ones about just encouraging people to stop smoking, but actually price changes and restrictions on sales and so on. And there was improvements in access to effective primary and secondary prevention. So I think there was a move, there was this transmission of technologies and know-how to these countries, which has actually been important. Okay, well, what about Russia? Well, essentially Russia had suffered major changes over an extended period. And I'm just going to go into this in a little more detail. So first of all, there was the pre-Gorbachev era. It was called the era of stagnation, where life expectancy really wasn't doing anything at all. And under Brezhnev. Gorbachev came along and introduced policies of openness and reform. Then we actually had Yeltsin, who presided over really the emergence of what at one point was called sort of cowboy capitalism in Russia, which was very damaging to its citizens. It was a very hard time in the 1990s to live in Russia. Most people still were employed by the state, even if they had, and it was very typical for a Russian to have several jobs, not just one job, but have multiple jobs to make ends meet. Because if you were employed by the state, you often had wage arrears 6-8 months at the height of things in the 1990s. People had to use all their ingenuity to actually to live and survive in that period. And there were great uncertainties, and a lot of things went backwards. The provision of free childcare disappeared, pensions became worthless. So it was in many ways a really hard time for the ordinary Russian. Putin then first came in 1999 and was president, of which Medvedev followed him, and now Putin's back in. So we can actually track in many ways these various points in the political history of Russia with the fluctuations that you see in life expectancy. So here again is the Russian life expectancy compared to the European Union countries. These were ones which were the aggregated European Union countries, excluding those Central Eastern European states which joined in 2004, 2005. So one rather salutary point is that life expectancy has improved in Russia over the last, since about 2005 to 6. And it's the longest sustained period for decades. But if you look at those horizontal lines, for men at least, it's still at the level that it was in the mid-1950s. And although it's fluctuated around there, it's a pretty dramatic and depressing picture that. For women, life expectancy today is just at historic highs compared to what it's been before. And as I'll tell you in a minute, there are actually, one of the distinguishing features of Russia are huge gender differences, sex differences. So what explains these fluctuations, which are historically unprecedented? Well, Gorbachev, when he came in 1985, introduced the anti-alcohol campaigns. This was a typical top-down policy. It wasn't about saying, please think about how many units you drink. It was burn down the vineyards, turn the production tap off, give people coupons. It was something you could do in a communist state. And it worked. So you see with the advent of the anti-alcohol campaign, which was associated with a lot of, that's not het, it says niet, so which means no. With the advent of the anti-alcohol campaign, the causes of death which went down most deeply are all the obvious ones which are related to alcohol. So very strong evidence for this sharp increase in the mid-1980s. But then you actually get the period that we moved on to, where essentially the collapse of the Soviet Union came along. It was clear for a number of years before it actually happened that this was what was likely to happen. The attention of policymakers and politicians and enforcement authorities and police drifted off from alcohol, and you actually already see a downturn in life expectancy. And then following the collapse of the Soviet Union, this precipitate decline in life expectancy. So this, as I've said, led to a period of chaos as well as economic liberalisation. So although economic liberalisation is beloved of neocon economists, it also did, there were aspects of the Russian economy which actually went backwards. So the number of horses used in agriculture during the 1990s in Russia went up by 700%. It was a problem. So it was also a period of liberalisation. So this is just Boris Yeltsin again on his tank. But one of the ironies, of course, about liberalisation was an abandonment in 1992 of any of the state monopoly in alcohol and any semblance of controls on alcohol at all. And what you see here is Spirit Royale. You can read it in English. It's not in the Cyrillic alphabet, because this is almost 100% ethanol imported from Western Europe and available for a few rubles in the 1990s on the streets of Moscow and other big cities. So Western Europe saw the sales opportunity and rushed in there, not just with chicken legs, which the Americans used from their emergency supplies, but also Europeans rushed in with 100% ethanol. So you had, actually, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, two things going on. You actually had, if you like, a spring back from the progress made by the anti-alcohol campaign, because a lot of people, once they're heavy drinkers, and perhaps under stressful situations like the collapse of the Soviet Union, if alcohol is available, which it became available in profusion, in lakes of it, will go back to it. So it's partly that, but it's also that alcohol became much more available. Then there was a bounce back there, low point in 1994. Things improved again, people got used to the new society. There's a run on the Russian ruble, that coincides very sharply with the decline in life expectancy again. And then since 2005, as I said, things seem to be improving. Putin at least created a much more ordered society, still very corrupt, but much more predictably corrupt. Okay, so alcohol is a key driver of these fluctuations. There's a lot of stuff that we and other people have done on it, but this is the one piece of evidence which, in my view, is overwhelming. So what you see in red is the fluctuations in life expectancy. And what you see in blue are the age-standardized death rates from acute alcohol poisoning. And acute alcohol poisoning, even in Russia, at its worst, only constituted 1.5% of total deaths. It is arithmetically not possible for acute alcohol poisoning to actually drive total mortality, which is what life expectancy reflects. The correlation between these two lines is minus 0.97. Every single point of fluctuation in the life expectancy curve is met with an equal one of acute alcohol poisoning. We're using acute alcohol poisoning here as a proxy measure of the prevalence of heavy drinking. in that society. It's not in itself of interest, it's just a proxy measure. And it's the best proxy measure. All of you know that it's very difficult to measure alcohol. In Russia, it's fiendishly difficult to measure alcohol, even from returns from taxation, because the Russians, particularly in the 1990s, were endlessly creative in their brewing and distilling of their own alcohol, and the Gorbachev anti-alcohol campaign, and people like Nemtsov and everything developed algorithms which included admissions for the hospital, alcohol-related things, together with the increase in the sales of sugar in retail shops, because this was assumed that a large part of the increase was actually due to home brewing. So essentially the fluctuations are very much related to alcohol. Now, I want to say something about cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease in all industrialized societies, urbanized societies, is very important. And look at this. This is mortality from circulatory disease and acute alcohol poisoning. So I'm using acute alcohol poisoning mortality again as a marker of the prevalence of extremely heavy drinking. Spirit drinking, that's what the Russians do. They drink spirits. You know, I like vodka, and you can actually have a very good evening in a Russian setting where you drink vodka like you drink bottles of wine here in the middle classes, which is that you don't just have one bottle of vodka on the table, you actually have quite a number and you get through them. So drinking spirits, high concentration of ethanol, very different from other patterns of drinking, and drinking to intoxication are key features. So what you see again is these extraordinary fluctuations, the parallels and the fluctuations of circulatory disease mortality. And I've got a graph here which I haven't put on, but shows that this is the case for ischemic heart disease as well. Now, this link between alcohol and circulatory disease at the population level is rather a challenge to the received wisdom, certainly in the West, of alcohol being cardioprotective. And that's partly because in this country and many other countries we don't drink, Western countries we don't drink in this particular way. But it does seem really to be the case. So I won't go into this in much detail, but this is from a case control study we did in the Urals, where we looked at premature mortality using proxy informants, and a proxy informant report of hazardous drinking, which included things like zapoi, which is a period of continuous drunkenness of 2 or more days when the person is withdrawn from normal social life. The prevalence in this population sample of working age men who were living in families was 11% in 2007. So it's hazardous drinking, that is one element of hazardous drinking as a problem. So not surprisingly, very strong links in alcoholic cardiomyopathy, cerebrovascular disease. Work we've done suggests that this is really going to be a very small minority. But cardiovascular disease in Russia is just about the highest in the world. This is from last year, from Circulation, the premier journal in cardiovascular disease, showing that Russia, for men and women, has the world's highest rates of the 33 countries which are considered to have good cause of death data for their purposes. And it's the case for ischemic heart disease as well as stroke. Cardiovascular disease is enormously important for explaining differences in life expectancy between Russia and the UK and Russia. So for men there's a 15-year difference, for women there's nearly an 8-year difference. This is the contribution of cardiovascular disease. Nearly 8 years, which is over 50% here for men, and 75% for women. Ischemic heart disease, an important fraction of that. So it's very important for explaining the international differences. So recent trends in cardiovascular disease, here they are, the fluctuations for cerebrovascular disease on the left in Russia, and for ischemic heart disease on the right. And you can actually see what a long way Russia still has to go, in particular compared to European countries, UK and Norway, which have consistently declined over this period for cardiovascular disease, both cerebrovascular and ischemic heart disease, where estimates are between 40 and 60%, depending on the countries, are actually the result of improvements in treatment. And that's one of the key punchlines here, is that still in Russia there's a failure to actually institute good evidence-based approaches. I'm going to skip that slide. So it's not just alcohol. I want to emphasize the average high level of mortality in Russia from cerebrovascular, cardiovascular disease, and other causes. It's due to high smoking in men, poor availability of primary and secondary prevention approaches and technologies, access to an organisation of good standard of medical care is not good either. But all those are somewhat speculative because there isn't good data. So we've got a new project which has just started. I was in Moscow last week, a launch meeting of this project funded by the Wellcome Trust and the Norwegians. It's got a very long title, where we're searching for an acronym: Cardiovascular Disease in Russia, Strengthening Evidence About Causes, Mechanisms and Prevention. If you just give me a couple of minutes, I just want to say something about sex differences in life expectancy. This is something I put in because I think it's pertinent to thinking about population levels as a whole. If you actually use data from the UN and accept these life expectancy estimates for countries where often there isn't any good evidence at all, and it's really a kind of posh guesstimate, if that, you actually see that male life expectancy, female life expectancy are very correlated across the entire range of life expectancies. But if you put the line of equality in, which is where everything would lie, if life expectancy in each country, in men and women in each country was the same, you see virtually all of the countries to the north, above the line, showing that for virtually all countries, females live longer than males. But the important observation is that down here, in low life expectancy countries, they're quite close to the line. But up here, they become much further away, and here's Russia with the biggest departure from the line. And this is because, essentially, if you move through the epidemiologic transition from a mortality regime dominated by infectious disease, which by and large is not much of a, it doesn't sort of care about gender too much. I'm not saying there aren't, but I'm not saying that isn't a component too much. We move through the epidemiologic transition to basically where the important drivers of mortality are lifestyle factors, where a man and woman can live in the same house, and one can be a couch potato and the other can be running the marathon. So this is an important aspect of the epidemiological transition that allows gender differences in life expectancy to emerge. So it's the rise of the individual lifestyle risk factors. I just want to look at the European experience of differences in life expectancy. Here are the same set of countries that I looked at initially. This is the difference in life expectancy between men and women. Here's England, Wales, again, the UK, and quite a variation. But in general, there's a trend, a downward trend, since the 1980s in this gap. And this is partly a result, well, I'll come on to what it's a result. Here are the Central and Eastern European countries, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia. And notice that actually, with one exception, which is the Czech Republic, there hasn't been as big a decline in the gap, and it's pretty big between men and women in these Central and Eastern European states, suggesting that an important part of their mortality regime is big differences in things like smoking and alcohol. Here, the Baltic states, with even bigger differences in life expectancy between men and women, with very little diminution in that difference, despite the fact these countries have only undergone very sharp improvements in life expectancy since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And here are the differences for Russia, which are the largest of any of those. So that's last two slides. So sex differences in life expectancy. European countries vary dramatically in the extent of gender differences in behaviours. And I've noticed I'm using gender differences in behaviour, but sex differences in life expectancy. I think technically that's correct in a way. Gender differences in behaviour, health-related, you know. Western Europe is showing a decline in these differences. And that convergence, that decline is partly a result of convergence in behaviours between men and women, which is simultaneously men starting to smoke less, but in some European countries, women starting to smoke more, or historically. So it's an uncomfortable convergence, isn't it? it's not all good news. But differences in Eastern Europe persist, and I think they're showing you that there are important components of these differences which cannot be reduced to treatment. So, last slide, conclusions. Communism and its collapse in Europe illustrates the profound influence of the social on health. The diffusion of knowledge and best practice in healthcare and public health is central. Health is central across. Bit of a typo there. Public health is crucial for population health. The rapidity of improvements is a cause for optimism. We have seen in the Central and Eastern European and even in the Russian experience that things can improve quite dramatically if things go in the right way, as well as in Russia. The Russian experience is a vivid warning that things can go badly wrong. There can be mortality reversals. In point of fact, the post-Soviet space is, together with Sub-Saharan Africa, the two areas in the world where there's been a reversal in life expectancy. The latter, of course, due to HIV/AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa. The willingness and ability of governments to prioritise improvements in healthcare and public health is critical. And although I haven't been able to go into that in a lot of detail, that is really what marks out certainly the Russia today from other countries, and certainly the Soviet period. International variations in sex differences and mortality is underlying the importance of less tractable cultural factors in determining health, which are not immutable because people change,